The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, owned by Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clayfrick, and Andrew Mellon, had been warned for 14 years that their pleasure lake would kill thousands. They laughed at the engineers. Then 16 million tons of water erased an entire town in 10 minutes, drowning 2,209 people while club members watched from the hilltop above. What you're about to hear is the story of how America's richest men created America's deadliest dam failure. How expert warnings were dismissed as alarmist nonsense. How working-class families paid with their lives for elite arrogance. And how the mathematics of negligence, every removed pipe, every lowered crest, every fish screen installed, added up to mass murder that went unpunished. Let's begin with what the engineers saw coming. November 1880. John Fulton, chief engineer of the Cambria Iron Company, stood at the rebuilt South Fork Dam and saw death waiting to happen. The dam stretched 931 feet across the South Fork of the Little Conemaugh River, holding back Lake Conemaugh. 450 acres of water. 70 feet deep at the dam face. 20 million tons pressing against an earthen barrier that leaked like a sieve. Who sent Fulton? Daniel Morrill, president of Cambria Iron and one of the most powerful industrialists in Pennsylvania. Morrill employed thousands in Johnstown, 14 miles downstream and 450 feet lower in elevation. He understood what gravity and water could do. Fulton's report to Morrill was clinical and terrifying. There appear to me two serious elements of danger in this dam. First, the want of a discharge pipe to reduce or take the water out of the dam for needed repairs. Second, the unsubstantial method of repair, leaving a large leak, which appears to be cutting the new embankment. As the water cannot be lowered, the difficulty arises of reaching the source of the present destructive leaks. He continued with mathematical certainty about what was coming. At present there is 40 feet of water in the dam. When the full head of 60 feet is reached, it appears to me to be only a question of time until the former cutting is repeated. Should this break be made during a season of flood, it is evident that considerable damage would ensue along the line of the Conemaugh. It is impossible to estimate how disastrous this flood would be, as its force would depend on the size of the breach in the dam with proportional rapidity of discharge. Morrill immediately forwarded Fulton's report to Benjamin Ruff, president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, the organization that had purchased and rebuilt the dam. Ruff's response has been preserved in the historical record. It stands as one of the most catastrophically arrogant statements in American industrial history. You and your people are in no danger from our enterprise. 5 words that would haunt 2,000 families. But who was Benjamin Ruff to dismiss an engineer's warning? A railroad tunnel contractor. A coke salesman. A real estate broker. He had exactly zero training in dam engineering or hydraulic systems. Yet he had supervised the reconstruction of the South Fork Dam without consulting a single qualified civil engineer. Why should anyone believe Ruff over Fulton? Because Ruff had money and connections. Because Fulton was just an employee raising inconvenient concerns. Because fixing the problems would cost money and delay the fishing season. The dam's history made Ruff's confidence even more absurd. The structure had been built originally between 1838 and 1853 by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as part of the Main Line Canal system. Engineers designed it according to accepted practices of the era. A puddled clay core for seepage control. 5 cast iron discharge pipes running through the base to drain or regulate water levels. A spillway at least 150 feet wide cut into the eastern abutment. By 1853, railroads had rendered the canal system obsolete. The dam was abandoned. In 1862, after years of neglect, it partially failed. The discharge pipes collapsed and water washed out a portion of the embankment. No one was killed because the breach was far enough from populated areas. The dam sat abandoned for nearly 20 years. Rain and snow melted through the earthen structure. Vegetation weakened the core. The discharge pipe tunnels became voids running through the foundation. Then in 1879, Benjamin Ruff saw an opportunity. Pittsburgh's industrial elite needed an escape from the smoke and heat of the steel mills. Ruff purchased the ruined dam and surrounding land, then assembled a group of investors. 16 charter members formed the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club in November 1879. Among them, Henry Clay Frick, already one of the richest men in America through his coke fuel empire. The club quickly attracted Pittsburgh's most powerful figures. By 1881, membership included 61 of the wealthiest industrialists, bankers, and attorneys in the United States. Andrew Carnegie, steel baron whose fortune would eventually exceed $300 billion in modern dollars. Andrew Mellon, banking magnate who would later serve as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents. Philander Knox, attorney who would become Secretary of State. Robert Pitcairn, superintendent of the Pittsburgh Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Daniel Morrill himself joined, specifically to monitor the dam from the inside. The membership fee was $800 per family, equivalent to $200,000 in today's money. The clubhouse seated 150 for dinner. The club owned 2 steam yachts, numerous sailboats, and a fleet of canoes. But the crown jewel was the lake. To create it, Ruff needed to rebuild the dam. What he did instead was construct a death trap. The original design had included those 5 cast iron discharge pipes, each 2 feet in diameter, running through the dam's base. They allowed controlled water release and complete drainage for repairs. Ruff found the tunnels where the pipes had been but didn't reinstall them. Instead, he filled the tunnels with rocks, mud, and debris. Why remove the pipes? They'd been sold for scrap before Ruff bought the property. Why not reinstall them? That would cost money. Why did that matter? Because base were more important than safety. The original spillway had been at least 150 feet wide. Ruff's reconstruction cut it to under 70 feet. Then he installed heavy wire mesh screens across the spillway supports to prevent stocked base from escaping. The screens accumulated debris during storms, further restricting water flow. The original dam crest had been 10 feet above the spillway floor, providing critical freeboard, the safety margin between normal water level and dam failure. Ruff lowered the entire crest by 2 to 3 feet to accommodate a carriage road across the top. This reduced freeboard to less than 8 feet. The 1862 breach had occurred in the dam's center. Ruff's crew filled this breach with whatever material was available. Contemporary accounts describe them using manure, straw, mud, and uncompacted earth. The repair created a sag of 2 to 4 feet in the dam's centerline, a visible depression that anyone could see. And the leaks? Observers documented persistent seepage from multiple points throughout the 1880s. How did club employees fix them? With hay bales and mud. Temporary fixes that did nothing to address the structural failures beneath. When Fulton inspected this nightmare in November 1880, his professional assessment was that catastrophic failure was inevitable. Morrill tried desperately to force repairs. In December 1880, he wrote directly to Ruff, demanding the installation of a discharge pipe to eliminate what he called the perpetual menace to downstream communities. Ruff refused. Another engineer, W.A. Fellows, inspected the dam and echoed Fulton's conclusions. The structure would fail. It was only a question of when. Ruff dismissed him too, relying instead on an informal assessment from Nathan McDowell, a local contractor with no dam engineering expertise, who declared the structure sound. So let me ask you this. When 2 qualified engineers say a dam will fail and kill thousands, and one unqualified contractor says it's fine, who do you believe? If you're rich and you want your fishing lake, you believe the contractor. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club wanted their lake. They wanted their bass fishing and their sailing regattas and their mountain retreat. They did not want to spend money reinstalling discharge pipes or expanding the spillway or properly reconstructing the compromised center section. So they didn't. And every spring when the snow melted and the rains came, residents of Johnstown looked up toward the mountains and made nervous jokes. "The dam's going to break someday," they'd say. Then laugh. Because it had held so far. Because surely someone would fix it before disaster struck. Because people with Carnegie's money and power wouldn't let thousands die over a fishing lake. Would they? At Lake Conemaugh, summer weekends began Friday evening when club members and their families boarded eastbound Pennsylvania railroad trains in Pittsburgh. 2 hours later they disembarked at South Fork. Carriages waited to transport them up the mountain road. There they enjoyed fishing for imported black bass, sailing on steam yachts, hunting, shooting competitions, evening card games and billiards, cigars on the clubhouse porch as the sun set over the Allegheny Mountains. By 1889, the club was spending $387,000 in modern currency to install a sanitary sewer system. For this project, unlike the dam reconstruction, they hired a qualified civil engineer. Isn't that fascinating? They hired an engineer for the sewage but not for the structure holding 20 million tons of water above 14,000 people. What does that tell you about their priorities? 8 miles away and 450 feet lower, Johnstown presented a radically different existence. 30,000 people lived in the narrow valley where the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers converged. 36 churches, 20 schools, a library, 2 opera houses. The economic heart was the Cambria Iron Company, one of the largest steel manufacturers in the United States. The work was brutal. Furnaces ran day and night. Workers toiled 60 hours per week minimum. A lucky worker earned $10 per week, equivalent to $16,600 annually in modern dollars. Yet the workers were optimistic. They were building America. Their labor produced the steel that carried trains across the continent. The population was heavily immigrant. Welsh miners, German craftsmen, Irish laborers. They came for steady work and the promise of something better for their children. The geography trapped them. High steep hills hemmed the narrow valley. When spring rains came or snow melted, the rivers rose and flooded the lower streets. This happened regularly. 2 feet here, 7 feet in the lower areas. Enough to move furniture upstairs and wait for the water to recede. But the floods were manageable. Always had been. Meanwhile, logging operations had stripped the surrounding mountains bare. Without forests to absorb rainfall, spring thaws and summer storms sent torrents racing down the slopes directly into the rivers. And 14 miles upstream, 450 feet above the town, 20 million tons of water pressed against an embankment that leaked, sagged, and had no way to be drained. Daniel Morrill died in August 1885, still worried about the dam. Benjamin Ruff died in 1887. Colonel Elias Unger, a retired Pittsburgh hotel owner, became club president and manager. Unger moved to a farmhouse near the dam to manage operations. He supervised the staff. He worried about the fish escaping. He made sure the cottagers were ready for the summer season. Did he hire engineers to address the structural problems that had been documented for 7 years? By spring 1889, the dam had survived 8 wet seasons since Fulton's warning. Each year it held. Each year the jokes in Johnstown got easier. Each year the club members felt more justified in their decision not to spend money on repairs. But the mathematics of water don't care about precedent. And in late May 1889, a weather system formed over Nebraska that would test every weak point in the dam's compromised structure. You're about to hear what happened when 20 million tons made their case. Subscribe to see how elite negligence creates mass casualties. We tell the stories where someone knew, someone warned, and someone with power chose profit over lives. May 28, 1889. A low-pressure system formed over Nebraska and Kansas. By the time this weather pattern reached western Pennsylvania 2 days later, the U.S. Army Signal Corps would later call it the heaviest rainfall event ever recorded in that region. Between 6 and 10 inches of rain fell in 24 hours across the Lake Conemaugh watershed. This was not a normal spring storm. Hydrologic analyses would later classify it as a probable maximum precipitation event, a 100-year flood at minimum. Thursday, May 30th was Decoration Day, later known as Memorial Day. Johnstown held its annual parade. The rain had let up just long enough for the festivities. Then it resumed with renewed intensity. By evening, Johnstown's streets were under 2 to 7 feet of water. Residents moved furniture and carpets to second floors. This was routine. Annoying, but manageable. At Lake Conemaugh, the situation was far more serious. The lake level rose throughout the night of May 30th. Rain pounded the reservoir's surface. Runoff from the surrounding mountains poured in through dozens of tributaries. The inflow exceeded anything the compromised spillway could handle. Engineer John Park, whom the club had hired to maintain the grounds, watched the water level rise. An inch every 10 minutes. Far too fast. By dawn on May 31st, the lake surface had risen more than 2 feet above its previous maximum levels. Water was flowing over the spillway crest, but the restricted opening, less than 70 feet wide and partially blocked by the fish screens, couldn't discharge anywhere near the volume entering the lake. Park understood hydraulic engineering enough to know what this meant. Once water began flowing over the top of an earthen dam, it would start cutting into the embankment. The erosion would accelerate. The channel would widen. Eventually the entire structure would collapse. At approximately 6 a.m., Park sent a messenger to South Fork with a warning. The telegraph operator there wired Johnstown. The dam is in danger of breaking. Had similar warnings been sent before? Yes. Did people pay attention? No. The dam was always in danger during heavy rain. The boy who cried wolf. Park and whatever workers he could assemble tried desperately to save the dam. They attempted to unclog the spillway. But removing the fish screens would let the fish escape, and club rules prohibited that. So they worked around the obstruction. They tried to dig a new spillway channel on the western abutment. But the earth was waterlogged and the excavation kept collapsing. They piled earth and rocks on the dam crest, trying to raise it above the rising water. But the lake was rising faster than they could build. At 11 a.m., another telegram went to Johnstown. The water is running over the breast of the dam and it is becoming dangerous. Did residents evacuate? A few headed for the hills. Most stayed home. Meanwhile, Elias Unger faced a terrible dilemma. He could see the dam was going to fail. Engineers had theorized that cutting through the end of the dam might allow a controlled release. The lake would drain more slowly. The flood would be less catastrophic. But if he did that, how could he prove afterward that the dam would have failed anyway? The only thing people would know for certain was that he had deliberately cut the dam and flooded the valley. He'd be blamed. The club would be liable. So what did he do? Nothing. He let nature take its course. That way the failure would clearly be an act of God, not human agency. By early afternoon, water was flowing over the dam crest in multiple locations. The center section, where the 1862 breach had been poorly repaired, was visibly sagging under the pressure. At approximately 3:10 p.m., witnesses at the dam saw the center section begin to give way. The initial breach was small. maybe 20 feet wide. Water poured through, rapidly widening the channel. Then the entire center section collapsed. Eyewitness accounts describe a wall of water 250 feet wide erupting through the dam. The sound was heard for miles. The force of discharge created a mist that rose hundreds of feet into the air. In approximately 45 minutes, Lake Conemaugh emptied. 495 million cubic feet of water. 20 million tons. The peak discharge rate was estimated at 325,000 cubic feet per second. How much is that? 4 times the average flow over Niagara Falls. About half the average flow of the Mississippi River at its mouth. This volume of water moving downhill at 40 miles per hour doesn't behave like a normal flood. It behaves like a liquid avalanche. The wave front was 36 to 40 feet high. It was half a mile wide in some sections. It carried everything in its path. Trees torn up by the roots. Boulders the size of houses. Railroad locomotives weighing 85 tons. Entire buildings ripped from their foundations. The mathematics are straightforward. The elevation drop from the dam to Johnstown was 450 feet over 14 miles. That's an average gradient steep enough to accelerate water to speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. The first populated area was South Fork, 2 miles downstream. The village had just enough warning. Residents ran for higher ground. The wave hit at approximately 3:20 p.m. Buildings were destroyed. But most people survived. Mineral Point, 3 miles downstream, wasn't as lucky. 16 people died there. At 3:30 p.m., the flood reached East Conemaugh. Engineer John Hess was in his locomotive at the rail yard when he heard and felt the rumbling. He didn't wait to confirm what it was. He threw his engine into reverse and raced backward toward the town, whistle screaming continuously. The sustained whistle was a warning everyone understood. It meant danger. Get to high ground now. Hess's warning saved hundreds. But at least 50 died in East Conemaugh, including 25 passengers stranded on trains in the rail yard. The flood picked Hess's locomotive, 85 tons of iron and steel, off the tracks and flung it aside like a toy. Hess survived. One witness described what he saw from high ground. The water was almost obscured by the debris. It looked like a huge hill rolling over and over. Do you understand what that means? It wasn't water anymore. It was a churning mass of debris held together by water. Buildings. Trees. Railroad cars. Industrial machinery. Steel beams. And increasingly, human bodies. At Woodvale, just outside Johnstown, the flood hit the Cambria Iron Works. The rolling mills and factories were obliterated. But worse, the flood consumed the Gautier Steel Works barbed wire factory. Miles of razor-sharp wire, twisted and tangled through the flood debris, would turn rescue attempts into carnage. By 4:07 p.m., exactly 57 minutes after the dam failed, the flood reached Johnstown. What happened next would produce images that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. 4 p.m. Johnstown. The streets were flooded as they often were in spring. People were on second floors, waiting for the water to recede. Then they heard it. A rumble. Low at first. Growing. Like thunder, multiple witnesses described it. But continuous. Building. Getting louder. Some people knew immediately what it meant. The dam had finally broken. They ran. Most hesitated. Was this just normal flood noise? The dam had held every other time. The warnings always turned out to be false. How long did they hesitate? 5 seconds? 10? That hesitation killed thousands. Mrs. Heslop, who was 6 years old, remembered her father calling the family to the window. My father called us to the window to see the flood coming. The water was up over the general office buildings. He told them to run to the 3rd floor. But he never got there. He drowned. And my grandmother drowned in the house with us. Mrs. Goodman described what she saw. Houses and children, and women crying and screaming for help. I watched a lot of people drown, going down. A little baby sitting in a crib all by itself floating down the middle of the river. Can you imagine watching that? A baby in a crib floating past while you're helpless to reach it. Knowing that baby is about to drown and there's nothing you can do. Gertrude Quinn was swept away with debris and rode a mattress through the flood. She was one of the lucky ones. Victor Heiser, who would later become a famous public health official, was 16. He rode the roof of his house until it smashed apart. He grabbed a piece of timber and floated downstream. Reverend H.L. Chapman and his family climbed to their attic as the water rose. They survived by clinging to the roof beams while the house floated and collided with other debris. Chapman later wrote, "None was afraid to meet God, but we all felt willing to put it off." The flood divided into 3 main currents as it spread across Johnstown's wider valley floor. Each current was approximately 1 square mile in destructive area. Frame buildings were lifted whole off their foundations. Some were immediately crushed. Others floated downstream with families still inside, people screaming from windows and roofs. Brick and stone buildings fared better but not much. The force of the flood, remember, this was 20 million tons moving at 40 miles per hour, could topple anything. The wave hit the hillsides surrounding the town and bounced back. A second surge came from a different direction, destroying buildings that had survived the first impact. People who had climbed to attics found their homes disintegrating beneath them. They grabbed floating debris, timbers, doors, pieces of roof, and tried to stay afloat. The water was filled with obstacles. Nails. Broken glass. Steel beams. Railroad cars tumbling end over end. And increasingly, miles of barbed wire that tangled everything together. One witness described trying to swim and finding the wire wrapped around his leg. He cut himself free with a piece of glass, slicing his hand open. The alternative was drowning. The flood surge lost energy with each oscillation. But it maintained enough force to carry debris and people downstream toward the Pennsylvania Railroad's stone bridge. The bridge had been built in 1887. 7 stone arches spanned the Conemaugh River. It was one of the strongest structures in the valley. When the flood hit it, the bridge held. The arches acted like a sieve. Water flowed through. Debris did not. In minutes, a massive jam formed behind the bridge. Buildings that had floated mostly intact. Railroad boxcars. Trees. Pieces of the Cambria Iron Works. Sections of the barbed wire factory. Bodies of animals. Bodies of people. And buried in this tangle, 300 to 400 people who were still alive. The pile grew to 40 feet high. It covered 30 acres. Elizabeth, one of the young survivors, witnessed a bridge collapse upstream. Just as we looked down toward the Poplar Street Bridge, the bridge separated right in the middle, and houses and horses, and everything possible that could come up the stream, came right at us. People trapped in the wreckage could hear others screaming. They could see people 20 feet away, caught in the barbed wire, unable to move. The wire had tangled through every layer of debris like steel cobwebs. Then someone smelled smoke. What caused the fire? Probably a coal stove from one of the houses. Or oil from a Pennsylvania Railroad tank car. Or coal still hot from a kitchen fire. The exact source has never been confirmed. Does it matter? The pile caught fire. The Johnstown newspaper later described it as burning with all the fury of hell. People trapped in the wreckage screamed as the flames approached. Those on the outer edges tried to crawl toward shore. Some made it. Many were caught by the barbed wire and couldn't escape. Rescuers worked through the night, pulling people from the wreckage. But the fire spread faster than they could work. And the barbed wire made every rescue attempt dangerous. You couldn't just pull someone out. You had to cut them free from dozens of wire strands. At least 80 people burned to death at the stone bridge. Some were still in their own homes, which had floated downstream intact and were now cremating their occupants. Can you imagine that? Surviving the flood. Making it all the way to the bridge. Being alive when the fire started. And then burning to death while rescuers worked frantically to cut you free from barbed wire. The fire burned for 3 days. Workers eventually had to use dynamite to break up the pile. By dawn on June 1st, the water had receded. Survivors emerged to a silence that felt unnatural. The constant noise of Johnstown, the furnaces, the mills, the trains, the voices, was gone. Mrs. Goodman described what they found. Vast heaps of mud and rubble filling streets, where there were still streets, up to the 3rd story. Entire blocks of buildings had been razed. 4 square miles of downtown Johnstown had been erased. 1,600 homes destroyed. 280 businesses gone. The Cambria Iron Works heavily damaged. The infrastructure, water, gas, sewage, completely destroyed. And the bodies. Everywhere, bodies. The official count would be 2,209 dead. But that number is almost certainly low. 99 entire families were wiped out. 396 children dead. 124 women widowed. 198 men left without wives. 98 children orphaned. 777 bodies, 1 out of every 3 recovered, could never be identified. They were buried in a mass grave at Grandview Cemetery. But many bodies were never found. They'd been ground to pieces in the debris. Or carried miles downstream. Bodies turned up as far away as Cincinnati, Ohio. The last confirmed recovery was in 1911, 22 years after the flood. The true death toll may have exceeded 3,000. 10 minutes. That's all it took. From the first rumble to the moment the flood surge passed. 10 minutes. Now let me tell you about the mathematics that made it inevitable. If this is making you angry, subscribe. Because this story doesn't end with the flood. What happened next? The investigation, the lawsuits, the complete lack of consequences for the men who caused this, that's where it gets truly enraging. On June 5, 1889, 5 days after the flood, the American Society of Civil Engineers appointed a committee to investigate. The committee was led by James B. Francis, one of the most respected hydraulic engineers in America. If anyone could determine what caused the South Fork Dam to fail, it was Francis. The committee visited the dam site. They examined the remnants. They reviewed the original design. They interviewed eyewitnesses. They commissioned a topographic survey. They performed hydrologic calculations. Their report, completed in January 1890 but not released publicly until June 1891, provides a precise technical autopsy of how negligence killed 2,000 people. Let's walk through the engineering failures. Failure 1. Removed discharge pipes. The original dam design included 5 cast iron pipes, each 2 feet in diameter, running through the base. They allowed operators to drain the reservoir completely for maintenance. They provided controlled release during heavy rain. They created a permanent low-level outlet. Benjamin Ruff removed these pipes. Or more accurately, didn't reinstall them after they collapsed in 1862. Instead, he plugged the tunnels with rocks and debris. What did this mean? Once the lake filled to capacity, there was no way to lower the water level except by waiting for it to evaporate or seep through the dam. The ASCE committee calculated that if the discharge pipes had been functioning, operators could have lowered the lake by several feet during the May 30th night. That additional capacity would have prevented overtopping even during the extreme rainfall event. Failure 2. Reduced spillway capacity. The original design specified a spillway at least 150 feet wide. Ruff's reconstruction cut it to under 70 feet. Then he installed wire mesh screens to prevent fish from escaping. These screens accumulated debris during storms, further restricting flow. The ASCE committee performed hydraulic calculations. With the inflow rates from the storm, the spillway needed to handle approximately 300,000 cubic feet per second. The actual spillway could handle perhaps 70,000 cubic feet per second at maximum. Where did the deficit of 230,000 cubic feet per second go? Over the dam crest, eroding the earthen embankment until it collapsed. A properly sized spillway would have passed the flood without the dam overtopping. Failure 3. Lowered dam crest. The original dam crest provided 10 feet of freeboard above the spillway floor. Ruff lowered the entire crest by 2 to 3 feet to accommodate his carriage road. This reduced freeboard to less than 8 feet. During the May 31st storm, the lake rose more than 2 feet above its previous maximum level. That put the water level within 6 feet of the dam crest. As the spillway backed up, the lake rose those final 6 feet and began flowing over the center section. If Ruff had left the original crest elevation intact, would the dam have overtopped? No. Failure 4. Compromised core structure. The 1862 breach had occurred in the dam's center, breaching the puddled clay core. Ruff's crew filled this breach with uncompacted earth, mud, straw, and manure. Proper dam reconstruction requires carefully selected materials placed in thin layers and compacted to specific densities. Ruff's fill created a weak section that settled under its own weight, producing the visible sag in the dam's centerline. When overtopping began, where did it concentrate? On this weakest point. The erosion accelerated rapidly through the compromised material. Failure 5. Inadequate downstream protection. The downstream face of an earthen dam must be protected from erosion with riprap, large stones that absorb the energy of water flowing over the crest. Ruff's reconstruction left the downstream face largely unprotected. When water began flowing over the top, what happened? It cut directly into the earthen embankment with nothing to slow the erosion. The ASCE committee's topographic survey showed the erosion pattern. Water cut a channel through the center section within minutes. The channel widened rapidly as more water flowed through. Within 45 minutes, a breach 250 feet wide had opened. The ASCE committee's conclusion was carefully worded but damning. They attributed the failure primarily to extraordinary rainfall that produced inflows exceeding the spillway's capacity. But they also noted that the original design had included features that would have prevented failure even during this extreme storm. They documented the club's modifications that eliminated these safety features. They acknowledged that reinstalling the discharge pipes and expanding the spillway would have prevented the disaster. What they didn't do was assign clear blame to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Why not? The report was sealed and not shared with other ASCE members or the public for over a year. When it was finally released, it had been edited. References to specific club modifications were softened. The language was made more technical and less accusatory. Who pressured them? Historians conclude that club members, who had significant influence in engineering and industrial circles, pressured the committee to downplay the negligence and frame the disaster as primarily an act of God. But the mathematics don't lie. Every modification the club made reduced the dam's safety margin. Removed discharge pipes. Restricted spillway. Lowered crest. compromised core, inadequate downstream protection, neglected maintenance. Each failure alone might not have caused disaster, but combined, during a severe storm, they created conditions where catastrophic failure was mathematically certain. And the engineers who warned them, Fulton, Fellows, Morrill, had identified these exact problems in 1880. The club had 9 years to fix them. Did they? Number. Why not? Because they didn't want to spend the money. 2,209 people paid the price. Now let me tell you what happened to the men responsible. In the immediate aftermath, club members fled. On May 31st, as the flood hit Johnstown, only about half a dozen club members were at the lake. Those present left immediately. They returned to Pittsburgh. They consulted their lawyers. And then they went silent. Within days, angry survivors traveled up to the club. They found abandoned cottages. Some broke windows and destroyed furniture. But there was no major violence. The members' public response was strategic. Many contributed to relief efforts. Andrew Carnegie donated $10,000 to build a new library for Johnstown. Henry Clay Frick donated thousands. About half the club members made financial contributions. What did the donations accomplish? They provided genuine help to survivors. And they provided legal cover. How could you sue men who were helping rebuild your town? But survivors tried anyway. Multiple lawsuits were filed against the club, alleging negligence. The legal arguments seemed straightforward. Engineers had warned the dam was unsafe. The club had ignored the warnings. The club had made modifications that reduced safety margins. The dam had failed. 2,000 people had died. But the lawsuits faced enormous obstacles. First, proving negligence required showing that the club members knew or should have known the dam would fail. The club's defense argued that they had relied on professional assessments, specifically, Nathan McDowell's opinion that the dam was sound. Did it matter that McDowell wasn't a dam engineer and that actual dam engineers had warned of failure? Apparently not. Second, the storm was unprecedented. The ASCE report had concluded that the extraordinary rainfall was the primary cause. The club's lawyers argued this was an act of God that couldn't have been prevented. Third, legal doctrine in 1889 didn't include modern concepts of strict liability. To win a negligence case, you had to prove that the defendants had a specific duty to the plaintiffs and had breached that duty. The club argued they had no specific duty to Johnstown residents. They were private citizens operating a private recreation facility. They hadn't forced anyone to live downstream. Fourth, and this is the cynical reality, who were the defendants? The richest and most powerful men in America. Andrew Carnegie's legal team was among the best money could buy. Henry Clay Frick had connections throughout Pennsylvania's political establishment. Philander Knox was literally an attorney. And who were the plaintiffs? Working-class families who'd lost everything. Many had no money for extended legal battles. By 1891, what happened to every lawsuit? Dismissed or settled for nominal amounts. Was any member held criminally liable? No. Did any member pay significant damages to survivors? Number. Did any member face any professional consequences? Number. The club quietly dissolved. In 1904, the club's personal effects were auctioned off. The cottages were abandoned. The clubhouse fell into ruin. The legal failure to hold the club accountable prompted a significant shift in American law. Before Johnstown, most liability cases required proving fault. After Johnstown, courts began moving towards strict liability doctrines, especially for inherently dangerous activities. The logic was simple. If you create a massive risk, Like damming 20 million tons of water above a populated area, you should be absolutely liable for damages if that risk materializes, regardless of whether you were negligent in a technical sense. But this legal evolution came too late for Johnstown survivors. For them, the message was clear. Rich men could kill thousands through negligence and face no consequences as long as they had good lawyers and political connections. The public reaction was savage. Newspapers across America denounced the club members. Political cartoons depicted them as aristocrats carelessly destroying working-class lives. A cartoon in Puck magazine showed club members fishing while bodies floated past. But did outrage translate to justice? No. And after a few years, even the outrage faded. The club members continued their lives. Carnegie built his library. He's remembered as a philanthropist. Frick continued his business empire. Today there's a Frick Museum. Mellon became Treasury Secretary. There's a Mellon Foundation. The irony is thick. These men's legacies are associated with cultural institutions and charitable giving. The 2,000 dead at Johnstown are mostly forgotten. But one thing wasn't forgotten. The story. In 1964, on the 75th anniversary, Johnstown held commemorative ceremonies. Over 250 flood survivors attended. All were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. They had been children when the wave hit. One woman brought the little shirt she'd worn through the flood. She'd had measles that day. She'd saved the shirt for 75 years. Another woman, Mrs. Heslop, recounted watching her father drown. Her voice was steady. She'd had 75 years to process it. But the pain was still there. In 1969, the National Park Service opened the Johnstown Flood National Memorial at the site of the South Fork Dam. You can visit today. The dam remnants are preserved. The stone bridge still stands. It's owned by Norfolk Southern Railway and still carries trains. The Johnstown Area Heritage Association operates the Flood Museum in Carnegie's Library Building. 777 unidentified bodies rest at Grandview Cemetery under a memorial that simply lists them as unknown. But here's what makes Johnstown's story even more tragic. It happened again. On March 17, 1936, St. Patrick's Day, another massive flood hit Johnstown. 25 people died. After 1936, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers finally took action. They dredged the Conemaugh River, built concrete flood walls, created channel improvements. They proclaimed Johnstown flood-free. On July 19, 1977, a severe thunderstorm dropped 11 inches of rain in 8 hours. Another flood. 80 people died. Why does Johnstown keep flooding? The narrow valley. The confluent rivers. The steep mountains that funnel runoff. But the 1889 disaster was different. In 1936 and 1977, the floods were natural events. In 1889, the disaster was man-made. A preventable catastrophe created by negligence, cost-cutting, and arrogance. In 1985, at a civil engineering conference, a researcher presented analysis of the Johnstown flood. His conclusion was mathematical and damning. The South Fork Dam failed because every safety feature was either removed or compromised. The disaster was inevitable given the modifications. The only question was which storm would exceed the reduced capacity. After his presentation, an elderly man approached. A retired structural engineer who had studied dam failures for 40 years. He said, "The Johnstown flood taught the engineering profession 2 lessons. First, safety margins exist for a reason. When you remove them to save money or add convenience, you're borrowing against disaster. Eventually the bill comes due. Second, when an engineer tells you something is unsafe, listen. Because engineers don't make warnings lightly. And when we're ignored, people die. Do those lessons apply beyond dam engineering? Yes. The Johnstown flood follows a pattern seen in disaster after disaster. Someone identifies a risk. Someone with expertise says, "This will fail. This will kill people. Fix it now." Someone with power or money says, "You're being alarmist. It's held so far. Fixing it costs too much. We'll take our chances." Then what happens? The disaster. Then the investigations. Then the reports that document exactly what the experts had warned about. Then the conclusion that it could have been prevented. Then, if the people responsible are wealthy and well-connected, what? No consequences. The Johnstown survivors understood this. They saw Carnegie's library go up and knew it was blood money. They watched the club members face no legal penalties and learned that justice depends on your bank account. Daniel Morrill knew it in 1880 when he sent John Fulton to inspect the dam. John Fulton knew it when he wrote his report. W.A. Fellows knew it when he echoed the warning. Did Benjamin Ruff know? Yes. He knew the dam was unsafe. He knew he should reinstall the discharge pipes. He knew he should expand the spillway. He knew the center section needed proper reconstruction. Did Andrew Carnegie know? Did Henry Clay Frick know? Did Andrew Mellon know? They were among the 61 club members. They received the reports. They were told the dam was a perpetual menace. What did they choose? Recreation over repairs. On May 31, 1889, at approximately 3:10 p.m., their choice became a 40-foot wall of water moving at 40 miles per hour. 10 minutes later, Johnstown was gone. The final count. 2,209 confirmed dead. 99 entire families wiped out. 396 children killed. 777 bodies never identified. Hundreds never found. 1,600 homes destroyed. 280 businesses obliterated. $17 million in property damage, $590 million in modern currency. And the cost to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club? 0. The dam remnants still sit above South Fork, Pennsylvania. You can visit them. Stand where the breach occurred. Look down the valley toward Johnstown. Do the math. 450 feet of elevation drop. 14 miles of distance. 20 million tons of water. 40 miles per hour. Then imagine you're John Fulton in November 1880, writing your report, knowing exactly what's going to happen, knowing that men with money won't listen. Or imagine you're an immigrant steelworker in Johnstown, May 31, 1889, hearing that rumble, knowing the dam has finally failed, having 10 seconds to decide whether to run or stay. Or imagine you're trapped at the stone bridge, tangled in barbed wire, watching the flames spread, knowing you're about to burn to death because someone didn't want to spend money on discharge pipes. That's the real story of the Johnstown flood. Not the water. Not the storm. Not the dam. The choice. The choice made by men who had the money to fix the problem and decided their fishing was more important than other people's lives. Does that choice echo across every disaster where warnings were ignored? Yes. Will it keep echoing until we learn that safety margins exist for a reason, that expert warnings should be heeded, and that when people with power prioritize profit or pleasure over human life, the bodies pile up fast? Yes. Johnstown taught that lesson in blood and fire. Are we still learning it?